good to be here today. Let me just kick off with the first slide. I'm Jasper. I'm a sustainability researcher at Coolset. I've been working there for 2 years. We're based outside of Amsterdam, so it's exciting to be here. I'm here together with my colleague Freddie. I'm assuming there's going to be no time for questions during this session, but we'll be here all day. You can spot us with the shirts. So today I'll be talking about Scope 1 to 3 and how you can align that together with your impact and ESG alignment. Let me just kick off with a very quick introduction. So I'm going to quickly introduce Coolset, then go over how to decode emissions, discuss Scope 3 in a changing landscape. Then I'll give examples of companies leading the decarbonization transition, and then really quickly go over a case study. I know everybody is ready for lunch. I am as well, so I'll just keep it brief, keep it short, and any follow-up questions I'll be happy to follow up on. I'll also have a QR code at the end with the slides, so you don't have to take pictures. You can scan that at the end if you want to have access to them. So quick overview of Coolset. Coolset was founded in 2021 and is active in over 11 countries. We're built for mid-market enterprises that have limited sustainability-related capacity and a preference for long-term internal know-how, which means that we work together with our clients from A to Z. We have 2 modules, compliance management, which is Scope 1 to 3, and carbon management, which is Scope 1 to 3, and compliance management, which is everything from CSRD, VSME, EU taxonomy. I know we're in the UK, but in the EU, these are really big frameworks that are now kind of also changing due to the regulatory landscape. I've heard Trump being mentioned a couple of times. He also has an influence here. So that's kind of something that we're also now working on. Happy to discuss further with anyone that has questions about that. So what do we do for Scope 1 to 3? We ensure that everyone that works with us on their Scope 1 to 3 assessment has a valid result within 4 weeks, and that includes your Scope 1, your Scope 2, and then Scope 3, which is usually between 80, 90, or 95% of your total emissions. So that's really where the work sits. We're certified by TÜV, which means that our results are in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we basically do it by identifying top vendors, ledgers, just kind of finding hotspots within your emissions. We also do that for CSRD, which stands for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Won't go into too many details there, but basically it's an ESG framework that ensures streamlined reporting and also has a disclosure requirement for Scope 3. We also do that for VSME, which is kind of the little brother of CSRD, also ESG reporting framework, but a lot more streamlined, only has around 100 data points. So now let's quickly go over emissions. I thought I'd bring over an analogy that might relate to you a bit more. Product LCA is the gravy, greenhouse gas inventory is the roast dinner, and I think as most people here will be able to confirm, you can't have a good roast dinner without the gravy. So I think that's also where the collaboration comes from, where the partnership between Coolset and One Click LCA has developed from. Just to give you a quick insight into what that actually means in practice, so LCAs show cradle-to-grave impact of product portfolios, whereas the greenhouse gas inventory adds up every product, site, and service. So to kind of summarize that, LCAs show product-level emissions, greenhouse gas inventories, so your Scope 3 essentially shows a company-level kind of output of all of that to come together. And how it works together is that LCAs basically show you the product-level emissions. They're really specific. And if you combine that together, for example, with kind of mapping out the whole value chain, and you say, well, for example, we're a textile company working with very many types of textiles. If you do LCAs for those textiles, you'll be able to know exactly where it comes from, kind of what the sources are, but also, especially going forward, you want to set decarbonization targets. And if you work with general emission factors, for example, you won't be able to do that. If you work with LCAs, you'll be able to say, well, we moved our production from China to Europe, and that already in itself is a huge kind of reduction in emissions that you can map with LCAs. So we integrate that into the platform. On top of that, these ESG frameworks also incorporate Scope 3. And also, I think, as Catherine has mentioned, SBTI is kind of a big thing a lot of companies are working on. That's kind of a decarbonization framework that also requires really granular emission data. So how that comes together, you need to calculate, you need to kind of find the hotspots, and together with LCA data, you can improve. So on the left-hand side here, you see ESG hotspots require precision measurement and detail, and that's kind of where it comes together for Scope 3. You kind of see where the hotspots are. So for example, a company might say, well, transportation and production are hotspots, but then LCA data comes in and offers actionable solutions to decarbonize. So Coolset has been around now for 3 years, and we've seen that companies are really keen on decarbonizing, But because the data quality is lacking, we see that that's also a big issue. And that's also what Alex mentioned, is the main point raised by everyone here today, is that data quality, or the lack of data quality, is the main barrier to actually have tangible solutions in place. So I think that's also very, very useful kind of to have that collaboration between One-Click LCA and Coolset to accelerate that and hopefully fill that gap as well. So why we partner, we have one platform for full spectrum sustainability. So we go from LCA to greenhouse gas, scope 1 to 3, and then we go back again. So what we do is we work on EPDs, product footprints, eco-design, circularity, biodiversity, even urban heat simulations together with One-Click LCA. Won't go into too much detail on that, but basically we encompass a wide range of topics, and we have a lot of built-in workflows. So if you work with us, you're gonna, there's a lot of automations. The buzzword AI has also been mentioned in our company, and we're now starting to build that out. I think we've launched it this week, so that's also quite exciting. I also want to ask a question to the audience. Who has published a sustainability report before? Okay, I think maybe like 30, 40%. And who is doing so or has done so already this year? Okay, I think if I can talk correctly, there's less hands. I think that's also kind of a tale of the time. We're seeing that due to this regulatory change, due to kind of like this macro situation that you described, companies are kind of holding back, seeing, okay, what's the market, where's the market going, what are we seeing, and are reporting, are less keen to report this year. So I think next year we'll see an uptick again, but for this year it's a bit slower, but nonetheless really good to see that some of you here are working on it this year as well. So now to get to the more interesting part. So as I mentioned, the EU has a very rapidly changing regulatory landscape right now, and at the heart of it is the CSRD, which, as I mentioned, requires ESG reporting, and the omnibus proposal, which is kind of the big ominous thing happening in Brussels right now, was published in February of 2025 and will likely narrow the CSRD scope by 80+%, which basically means that before, companies with more than 250 employees in the European Union had to report on sustainability under CSRD. Now they want to move that scope up to companies with more than 1,000 employees or even 3,000 employees. So they're still debating it. I think by the end of the year we'll have more clarity. But what it is showing is that there's kind of a lot of kind of vulnerability within the European Union right now. There's a lot of kind of debate. The more green parties are, of course, fighting back. The more kind of conservative center-right parties and far-right parties are saying, no, we need to kind of scrap this whole thing. We need to fight now, and I think also they're comparing themselves a bit with America, which I'm not too big of a proponent of, but that's a discussion that's happening right now. And what we're seeing is that simpler ESRS standards, which is basically like the actionable part of CSRD, are being rolled out, which is arguably a good thing as well because it was very complicated, but Scope 3 will be part of the future as well. So we'll keep seeing that in the reporting. So what we're seeing is that there's going to be a mandatory element of Scope 3 reporting, but what we're seeing right now with a lot of our customers is that they're doing it voluntarily because they see that investors give them breaks on their loans, so they have reduced interest rates. A lot of banks, they want ESG data if they want to give out loans in the first place. Competitors, they also want to have ESG data, so they get the tender or the customer over the ones that don't have ESG data. So there's a lot of signals from the market that having ESG data is not only a regulatory requirement, but also a market benefit in a very rapidly developing landscape. So here's a big table, won't go into too much detail. Once again, you can download the slides at the end, but here the part at the bottom left where I mentioned that even after this change, Scope 3 will stick around. I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind. One interesting thing that I might want to note as well is that before, over 50,000 companies were in scope of CSRD in the European Union. That's a lot. Right now, with the scope of 1,000, that's going to be reduced to less than 7,000. So that's going to be the really big companies, the ones that arguably already had teams in place, already had kind of all those flows. And we often compare it to financial data, because back in the days, financial accounting was also kind of the Wild West, wasn't streamlined. And then at some point, they started having these financial audits every year, and they started saying, well, we need to kind of streamline this process. And now there's a baseline, there's benchmarks, there's data to compare it to, and it's become unthinkable to work without it. And we're seeing that also happening with ESG data, and now it's kind of hard because companies are starting with that, and they don't know where or how. But we think that within the next 2-3 years, once that kind of settles down and companies have the teams in place, have the structures in place, the political situation has kind of regulated itself, they have more of an idea of where to go. I think we're going to start seeing more of like an ESG landscape that resembles the early days of the financial reporting landscape. So why is Scope 3 and ESG reporting matter now? So we've done research among 187 companies throughout the European Union, and of those companies, 90% have said that they want to keep reporting even if they no longer have to. So that's a really big signal in the market that we've also seen from our customers, but also prospective customers or just people that we've spoken to. I hope to speak to some of you today and perhaps also hear your stories on how you view this development if you're working for a company that has kind of ESG ambitions or had ESG ambitions perhaps. We also see that 89% of investors consider ESG in investment decisions, which is also kind of a sign that, investors maybe know that this political cycle won't have that much focus on ESG, but in the next 10, 20 years, when those investments start paying back, we will see that ESG is a necessity in a very rapidly changing environmental climate. So what we also see is that more than 70% of investors cite unreliable ESG data as the biggest barrier to sustainable investments. So I think also from the financial industry, we're seeing a lot of kind of push for this development. So it's also kind of surprising but disappointing to see that then the political landscape is so reserved. And we're also seeing that new regulations such as the CSRD, the ESPR, Digital Product Passport, and CBAM, which I also heard coming up in a conversation today, are expanding fast, and these things are all still on the table. So at Coolset, we're also working on EUDR, which is this big deforestation framework. We're working on EcoVadis. There's kind of a lot of frameworks out there that still require reporting or kind of incentivize reporting that are big drivers of change. So what's the strategic importance of Scope 3? So on the one hand, it's supply chain resilience. It's a good way to identify emission hotspots so you can flag operational and reputational risks across the supply chain. So really seeing that companies doing that already know, okay, well, in the future, you might have a CO2 tax, so you want to know where are the biggest emission hotspots so you can focus on reducing those. It's also about positioning. You embed your carbon risk in procurement, budgeting, and procurement development to stay ahead of regulation. So we see that companies that kind of run behind on regulation, they're often playing catch up, and that's a bad thing when you're having to report, but it's also bad because your competitors are way ahead of you and will ultimately get the customers that are more focused on sustainability. It's also about cost modeling. So you can identify suppliers or categories exposed to high carbon costs, which can enable finance to mitigate margin risks in advance. So as I mentioned, for example, the CO2 tax is an example, but we're also seeing kind of a changing market where, generally speaking, Scope 3 is a big part of procurement, and you want to kind of have a value chain that works for you as a company, not just now, but in the future as well. So here, to make it a bit more practical, I had a look at 4 UK companies. I had some Dutch ones as well, but then I figured, no, I'll keep it very local so everyone here kind of hopefully sees some familiar faces. Arguably, Unilever is a bit of a contested case. I would say they're Dutch, but I saw that they're recently, a couple years ago, fully settled in the UK. So I'll give that one to you guys. Let's start with them. So Unilever is a massive company. I think we probably all know it. And what they've done in the last couple of years in terms of concrete actions is that they've set up supplier climate programs and onboarded over 300 key partners, which is 44% of their Scope 3 emissions. And just to give an indication, that's really big for a company of that size. And I think to kind of give an example of what that means is that they've gone to their supplier, for example, of electronic products or kind of something in the factory that they need, and they said, well, if you want to work with us, we need you to kind of also disclose your Scope 3, or you need to kind of work on certain decarbonization trajectories so that we can justify working with you in the future rather than going to a vendor that has more ambitious plans. Aside of that, they have carbon-intensive sourcing addressed through regenerative agriculture, deforestation-free commodities. So we're seeing also these regulations coming up, but companies like Unilever are kind of ahead of the curve and focusing on already kind of mitigating those risks that are coming up in the future. What that means in terms of quantified results, it's a 42% reduction in their Scope 3 industrial emissions and 30.3% in forest and agriculture by 2030 with a 2021 base. As you'll see in the other examples as well, most of the kind of quantified results are based in the future because companies are really starting to report now. So there's not many companies that have a baseline that's 5 or 10 years old. They're really starting to report now, and most of these companies report on SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, which sets these reduction targets that have to be measurable but also kind of achievable. So you can't just say, 50% in 2030, we'll see how we get there. You have to also say, well, we're going to get there by reducing our value chain emissions, by, for example, going electric, by moving operations from China to Europe, by changing, for example, virgin plastic to recycled plastic. There's a lot of things you can choose, but it has to be certified by SBTi. So this is Unilever's ambition. Tarmac, it's a big UK company. They basically have achieved 75% carbon reduction on the A64 by resurfacing without offsets using low carbon binders and an electric plant. I'm not sure what that means. But basically what we see here, and I've read an article about this, which I found really, really interesting, because it shows that you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. You don't have to go out there and do all these new things. Within the existing processes, you can kind of see how you can change and update these flows. And also sustainability is often linked to resource efficiency, which in itself is a way to make the process cheaper. So we're seeing here that they have a really good kind of approach that works for them now. They're piloting it still, but we're seeing companies like these making really big changes. And they also have a responsible procurement program, which requires supplier engagement on Scope 3, similar to Unilever. And then the quantified result is that they're targeting 2050 net zero across the value chain, which is a really kind of ambitious target to set, as it basically means they don't want to have any emissions under the kind of the line. And of course, with regards to the highway, they have the A64 innovations are now broadly embedded in the way they asphalt these roads. BT Group, I think formerly British Telecom, they basically sent out the supplier contracts and said that they require emissions disclosure via the Carbon Disclosure Project and net zero commitments. So that's also kind of a signal that any vendor that works with them in the future has to commit to these targets. And that also, not just from the perspective of BT Group, but also from the perspective of the market as a whole, we're seeing that companies that want to work with bigger companies often have to kind of commit to these targets, so that not from a regulatory perspective, but from a market perspective, you want to set these targets or work together with these companies in order to kind of get these contracts. They also have an integrated carbon KPI that they've set into their procurement, which means that for every kind of customer or every new supplier they want to have kind of a target on how many emissions they can output either per pound or per product that they sell to them. And the quantified result here is that Scope 3 is 81 to 95% of their footprint, which we're seeing in most companies, and they aim to reduce their supply chain emissions by 42% by 2031. And they also want to be net zero by 2041. Out of all companies that have committed to SBTi, around 10% have a net zero target. So yeah, it's already like within that ambitious group, these are the very ambitious ones. Sainsbury's, I think everyone knows it here. They've collaborated with suppliers also via the Carbon Disclosure Project and RAP, which I think is the Waste and Resource Action Program, to align targets by 2025. They've also developed lower emission product ranges, such as their Angus beef. They've decided to reduce the emissions by 25%. Not sure how at this point, but I think there's a lot of ways to reduce emissions from cattle by giving them different feed, for example. Not sure how they did it here, but it shows that within their own value chain, within things they can control, they're focusing on these actually very valuable reduction strategies. They also invested in EV charging rollout, and the quantified results are that they've cut Scope 3 emissions by, or they want to cut Scope 3 emissions by 50.4% in their operational operations, and 36.4% in their agriculture by 2030 as well. I think disclaimer here, with all of these companies that have set decarbonization targets, they're not always met. So I think now we're seeing some companies that have set them in 2015 and are kind of reevaluating now. Quite a few of them haven't met those targets. So I think also take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, yeah, they have to be verified by the SBTi. So I think it's more than just a nice marketing stamp on their product. I'll keep this really brief. So how you can turn raw data into ESG report. You start with the operations and your suppliers. You go over to data collection, which is where the finance and procurement teams come in. And this is also where LCA data becomes really useful from one-click LCA. Then you do the emission calculation within an ESG software. This is where you could use a software like Coolset. And this requires an ESG plus a finance team. Also, if you don't have an ESG team, don't worry. We're also working with a lot of companies that only have, for example, a procurement manager or kind of an operational manager, HR managers even. We're seeing that in these early days, a lot of companies kind of give the ESG responsibility to existing teams. Then you report on ESG metrics, which you do with the team or someone else. And last but not least, you write an ESG report of hopefully we'll start seeing more again in the coming years. And together you have a value of an end-to-end ESG platform. Thanks for joining. QR code for anyone that wants the slides. I think I'll leave the questions for just come over if you want to have a conversation. I'm really keen to chat and hear about your insights. But for now, thanks everyone for your time, and enjoy lunch.